Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session. This is Angelica, head of the ALN Academy. The ALN Academy is an institute to promote the rule of law through education for the development of the continent. And today, together with Thomson Reuters Foundation, we have prepared for you this webinar on compliance, the 80 set of compliance for NGOs. I'd like to introduce today's speakers. We first welcome our audience on Zoom and on our YouTube channel. Please note that this session will be recorded on YouTube in case you will want to revisit it. So let's start with Kris Wallace. He's the head of internal audit of the IFRC since April 2020. Before joining IFRC, Kris spent the past decade working in audit and investigation leadership roles across the UK government. During his career, Kris has worked extensively in the field, leading audits and investigations in over 50 countries, including conflict-affected countries such as Sudan, Somalia, and Sierra Leone. He has extensive experience in leading high-profile and media-sensitive investigations and led the development and implementation of the DFID Safeguarding Investigation Team. From 2017 to 2020, he was a member of the Audit Committee of the International Fund for Agriculture Development, where he developed the risk management approach and provided training and advice to IFAD's senior management team on how to embed and utilize risk management across the organization's audit portfolio. Kris is a professionally qualified audit leader with specialist training in assurance, risk management, counter-fraud, and corruption, as well as safeguarding. Kris acts since December 2020 as a non-executive director of the International Association of Professionals in Humanitarian Assistance. As a second speaker, we have Oyebisi Babatunde Oluseyi, the executive director of the Nigerian network of NGOs, and he has over 18 years been in an internationally respected authority on the growth of civil society, campaigning, and advocacy, particularly as they concern development on the African continent. Prior to this, he worked with UNICEF in New York as the global coordinator for the UNICEF Rural Voices of Youth Initiative. Oyebisi also serves on the executive committee of the civil society pillar of the Community of Democracy, an intergovernmental organization, and has since 2024 headed successively a series of portfolios of activities on development policy, civil society, strengthening and participatory governance. Currently, he's an advisory council member for the International Center for Nonprofit Law, where he advises the staff and board on program planning, funding, and implementation. He also serves as a member board of directors network of West African NGO platforms and African NGO Council. At A4AI Nigeria, he is the champion for the Consumer Advocacy and Pricing Transparency Working Group, which focuses on protection of digital consumers to advance access and affordability. He's the co-chair for the Open Government Partnerships Citizens Engagement Technical Working Group. As a third speaker, we have Willie Oelofse. He's a director at ALN Kenya, Anjarwalla, and Khanna. He heads the law firm's forensics, risk, and compliance practice. He has over 25 years of practical experience in forensic assignments covering various jurisdictions and industries, and has successfully advised organizations in addressing complex matters on the risk of fraud, corruption, and non-compliance in both private and public sectors. Willie commenced his career as a law enforcement officer in the service of the South African Police Service. As a former detective captain of the SAPS, he specialized in the investigation drug-related organized crime cases. Willie also received a special award from the Commissioner of the SAPS in 1997 for his handling of a narcotics-related investigation. As a fourth speaker, we have Aisha Abdallah. She heads the Dispute Resolution Department at ALN Kenya, Anjarwalla, and Khanna, covering offices in Nairobi and Mombasa. Her practice focuses on commercial litigation with a particular emphasis on fraud, economic crime, and disputes over land, the environment, and natural resources. Aisha is a dual qualified as an advocate of the High Court of Kenya and Solicitor of England and Wales. She joined ALN Kenya from Shoesmiths in the United Kingdom in 2012 and has substantial experience in complex, high-value cross-border litigation. Aisha was appointed to the MARC Court in 2017, the AD arm of the Mauritius Chamber of Commerce and Industry, alongside some of the world's most eminent arbitration experts. Then finally, as our moderator, we have Shalom Ndiku. He is the Thomson Reuters Foundation's Legal Program Manager for Africa, overseeing and managing its pro bono service, Trust Law, in Africa. He collaborates with NGOs, social enterprises, and lawyers working on or interested in pro bono on continent. He facilitates pro bono legal assistance for Trust Law's members and supports various research programs on a cross-section of uniquely African and transregional issues, such as criminal justice, social enterprise, regulation, health rights, freedom of expression, women's rights, and legal reform. We welcome you, and Shalom, I give you the floor.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Angelica, and I am humbled and honored to be here moderating this panel with speakers who I believe are highly qualified and truly exemplary at this topic of compliance. And just as Angelica mentioned, the Thomson Reuters Foundation has partnered with the ALN Academy, who are members of the Thomson Reuters Foundation and part of our network, to bring together experts to talk about compliance for NGOs, but also to share with various stakeholders in the NGO sector across the continent on the importance of this. And I just, before we commence, I just want to state that thank you for joining this webinar. We truly appreciate your presence. And I'll jump straight into it and sort of pose an introductory question to each of our panelists to very briefly just speak to what they think about when they hear compliance, what it means to them, and what it should mean to those on the call. So I'll start with you, Willie, sort of just to give an introduction and your thoughts on this. Willie, can you hear me?
Thank you, Shalom. Very good question, and I think if you look at this sector, it's probably ranked as the most trusted sector in the world because of what we do and so on. But NGOs are certainly not immune to from compliance risk. If I think about compliance risk, I think about it a bit like broadly, and I really think one must bring into consideration three elements. The first one is our internal risk and compliance issues. You know, NGOs are focused on mission, and speed of delivering that is essential. And as a result, we sometimes find that that prevents us from implementing controls and a strong control environment. Even more extreme in certain instances where we're seeing strong compliance frameworks as a hindrance or too much red tape, and if that prevents us from or seen as unnecessary, and if that prevents us from achieving our operational processes, then sometimes we circumvent these processes and controls. So I really think that's that's important from an internal point of view. From an external point of view, I think I must mention international regulation. We've got legislation and regulations with extraterritorial reach. That's definitely applicable across the globe. We've got as strong local regulation as well, whether it's tax, whether it is anti-bribing corruption, whether it is NGO-specific regulation. It is critical that that forms part of our thinking when we think about compliance. To add some complexity to that, we've got international NGOs that are operating across multiple of jurisdictions, which makes it even more complex. And then just from a personal experience point of view, then we find hot topics that are on our radar on a regular basis, and this is the last number of years: safeguarding, sexual harassment, bullying, and other harassment. So the way I see compliance and what we have to include, I think these 3 or 4 elements are definitely critical.
Thanks for that response, Willie. And I think you've truly started to paint a broad picture of compliance, especially as it applies to NGOs. Now, Kris, I want to transition to you, and you obviously have interests in working with international organizations, development partners, donors, and you have that experience, and you've been in these organizations. So from your perspective, what are some of the compliance issues that arise and might impede NGOs from entering into these partnerships or getting funding? What's your experience like from that point of view?
That's a really good question. I think most NGOs, when discussing with donors, at least from my experience when I was in different, is compliance is seen as a dirty word. It's seen as something that is burdensome, that is getting in the way of delivering humanitarian and emergency responses. But I think from the donor perspective, compliance is about them being able to protect their interests and how they respond to their changing risk appetites. So a good example is if you look at the current COVID crisis, a lot of donors are becoming very, very risk averse. So they're increasing their compliance requirements. And certainly when I worked at Impede, they were known as one of the most heavy-handed donors for their compliance requirements. They need to show everything. I think some of the biggest challenges for the NGOs when I was out in the field was often NGOs would sign up to agreements with donors which had heavy compliance requirements on what they had to report on and report against. And this is not just financial, this is also around operation delivery, without fully understanding the capacity they would need to meet that compliance framework. So whenever I look at compliance, I always look at it at risk versus reward. So the compliance framework needs to be balanced, it needs to be structured, and it needs to ultimately help deliver the mission. I think too often compliance is seen as a tick box exercise, and that is often driven by the donors. For me, some of the biggest challenges the NGOs face, at least from my experience, is that they don't have an ability to evidence their compliance framework in discussions with donors or to articulate it. Many NGOs haven't captured their compliance or control framework, mapped it out in a way they can easily discuss with donors, saying these are the current controls we have, this is how we would mitigate these risks that you're worried about. Or simply say, we don't have controls to mitigate this risk, could you help us develop something? And a good example of that is linking back to the point that Willie made around sex exploitation and abuse. When the Oxfam scandal broke, there was a significant shift in donor expectation around control frameworks for sexual exploitation and abuse and how we would meet the new compliance standards. Many NGOs simply said, yes, we can meet it, no problem, and took funding and then suddenly found themselves under a lot of pressure to deliver something they weren't ready for, because to be fair, the industry itself wasn't ready at the time. So it's being aware of what you're signing up to, and it's the realities. I think the other side of it is, not having some standard documentation that you can share with your donors to show that you've got a compliance framework. So having an annual external audit report of your finances, but on top of that, where there's action suggested by the auditors, having an action plan, showing that you've got a way to address it, having an assurance map, so you can say to them, these are the risks we face, this is our assurance map, these are our controls that mitigate them, what do you think? And finally, to be quick, I would say many NGOs need to be more robust in their discussions with donors and to ask them why a donor is asking for compliance or type of compliance requirement. Because often there can be misunderstandings around the language or the purpose of a control or compliance point that's being asked for. So I think being clear with your donors and having good and open conversations with them before you sign the dotted line is just really important. I hope that was helpful. Good.
Thanks for that, Kris. I think that's definitely insight that I hope those on the call can gain benefit from. So, you know, we've spoken to Willie. We've heard your perspective as an expert in compliance, and Kris, you know, from a more global point of view. And a lot of our participants are NGOs, our organizations. So I want to segue to Oyebisi. Oyebisi, you represent, you know, a large network of NGOs in Nigeria, if not the largest. Now, what are some of the more common compliance issues that they face? Just bringing it down to a very practical level.
So in terms of bringing this down, can I confirm that you can hear me?
We can hear you. It's
Hello?
a bit muffled, but we can hear you.
Okay, brilliant. In terms of bringing this down, I will try to situate some of the realities that we are seeing in terms of organizational response to compliance, and then to mention some of the challenges. The first response that we are seeing is that of hiding, where you find organizations not necessarily showing up on the front burner because they are not complying with regulations. Because they do not know the regulations that are there, and immediately they got to know that the regulations are there, they go into hiding. That's the first response. The second response is that of those that have deliberately said to themselves they won't comply because they do not respect, or they do not like, or they feel that some aspects of the law are not respectful of their rights or their operations. The third response that we're also seeing are those that have come out open to say no, we won't comply to this, and you know we've had public protests to compliance at some of those things. The fourth response has to do with those around now what we call participation, where organizations are complying, however, that they are using lessons from that compliance to retool the laws, to sit down with government, and to say this is how best this law should work.
Oyebisi.
Hello.
Hi, Oyebisi. Our participants cannot hear you well due to the connection. I think it's a bit muffled. So maybe I'll transition to Aisha as you set yourself.
I heard, is it better now?
Yes, it's a bit muffled. We can't hear properly. Now we can see you actually, but the sound is not ideal. So maybe you can fix that.
Okay,
I'll go to Aisha, then I'll come. You know, it's still the same. It's still muffled. But now it's clear. Charles says
okay, the sound is a lot better now.
It's better. I think it's a bit better. Okay. All right. So I'll Oyebisi will come around back to you once that is sorted. Aisha, saving the best from the last. I think your insight on matters compliance. Many would suspect, including myself, that you know it could be purely legal. But in previous conversations, you highlighted how you know compliance is layered across many issues. Now, one aspect of compliance involves being prudent financially with your controls. What risks from your experience over the years and consequences do NGOs face where they have poor or non-existent financial controls, and what do they expose themselves to?
Thank you, Shalom, and good afternoon, everyone. I think I've always advised clients to pay attention to money. Big money, small money, it all matters at the end of the day. I don't think we feel we have enough money to meet our good objectives. So we need to be careful and prudent and show value for money. If we are not exercising good financial controls, the first thing that would happen is there would be a lot of operational disruption that you would face as an NGO. So worst case scenario, you might even find that your bank accounts are frozen, pending some sort of investigation into, what you've done with your money, and that would cause a huge disruption. But even the leakage of small amounts regularly would create challenges to the sustainability of your organization, your ability to pay your staff, your ability to pay rent, and your ability to meet your core objectives. So primarily, the first thing you need to think about is money matters, because it affects your ability to deliver what is your core mandate and to meet the people you want to help. Obviously, there are legal consequences. So if you are a senior officer in an NGO or you're the founder, you may be facing personal liability. And sometimes this could be a criminal liability if you are considered to have somehow siphoned funds, stolen funds, been unable to account for donor funds, or somehow, assisted with some sort of money laundering. So these are all very serious criminal consequences. Aside from that, even if there isn't a crime in place, you might find people who donated money to you seeking the refund of their money on the basis that you misused it, you didn't use it for the purposes you said you would, and you are unable to account for it properly. There's also the risk of reputational damage. So again, this affects sustainability, because if you don't have a good reputation, then good donors will be wary of working with you, and other people who might be your partners but might be wary of partnering with you, and you may even struggle to attract good staff members and to keep them. So protecting your reputation and growing it is very, very important. It also has an impact on your staff morale. So if you are known to be an organization that leaks money, then this may affect staff, because they may think that actually one of the reasons they don't get good benefits is because you are essentially spending the money in the wrong areas, and they may be working very hard and not seeing that they're being appreciated. So overall, I would say financial control is very important for the sustainability of your organization, and it goes beyond legal consequences. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, very, very concise and relevant response. Willie, I want to come back to you. I've worked in an NGO, and sometimes you're stretched. You're trying to do good. You're trying to save the world. You're trying to deliver water, healthcare. And these things matter, right? So you say compliance is for the Safaricoms, the MTNs, the Dangote's company. Why should it matter for that 2-woman NGO in Accra? Why does it matter that NGOs should focus on compliance as compared to their core mission?
Good questions, Shalom. And when you ask that question, I see 3 things. Firstly, and you mentioned Safaricom and the corporates, but it makes good business sense. Now, I know we are non-for-profit and the likes, but like you said, NGOs are trying to do good things. They're trying to change the world and the likes. But they have to ensure that the value that they're distributing actually reaches the actual people, the actual communities that really needs it. So I think there's a personal responsibility on the leaders to do the right thing. Aisha mentioned financial control. You can't achieve good financial control if you don't have a good, solid, effective compliance program. That's essential. The second thing that's really important, and I mentioned this, is to to comply with regulations, whether it's international or local, you have to comply. You can't be investigated and sanctioned all the time by the relevant regulators in whichever jurisdiction it finds application. And then last but not least, I think for NGOs, reputation is key. I mean, we know what Warren Buffett said about reputation. It takes you a long time to build it, and you can really lose it in one transaction. So because of the fact that NGOs are queuing for funding, I think the reputation and actually all three of these aspects are playing a vital role and are critically important. And those are the reasons why we have to have a solid compliance program, taking all of this into consideration. Shalom.
Thanks for that. Thanks for that, Willie. And I think I like how you've broken it down and really made it relevant. So I want to go back to Oyebisi, and Oyebisi has sent me a direct message. He's doing one of the important things that NGOs do. He says he's at the office of the president. He was called suddenly, and obviously he had to go. But Oyebisi, I want to come back to you. Your connection is now stable. Maybe shed some light again on your experience with compliance as you know, a network of NGOs in Nigeria from a practical point of view. So I'll hand it over back to you.
So I was actually saying that we're seeing some level of response to regulations, and I'm trying to situate the organizational responses the way we have seen it and the trends that we're seeing as the Nigerian Network of NGOs. I recall that the Nigerian Network of NGOs is a membership-based organization, and we work across the country in Nigeria with around 2,900 members. So in terms of the trends that we're seeing in terms of organizational response to regulations, one, we are seeing that one that we call hiding, where nonprofits, after they've known that these regulations are there, they now start hiding in order for them not to be seen because they've not been complying with regulations. The second one is that of resistance, where some organizations have said they would not comply with regulations, and it's a deliberate decision out of the fact that they do not feel that some regulations are respectful of their rights enough. The third one that we're seeing is the vocal opposition to regulations, and this includes not complying and also coming at regulations more directly and openly. While the other one that we're also seeing is that of participation. So we've seen nonprofits that would say, yes, we would comply. However, we would use lessons that we're learning from compliance to retool the law and to sit down with regulators, to sit down with NGOs themselves and say, this is how this regulation should be in practice, and this is how we can use the lessons we are learning to retool the law. The last one is that of litigation, where organizations are saying, no, we won't comply, we don't like this law, and they've gone to the courts to seek proper interpretation and also sometimes ask for this to be expunged. Now, when you look at this, in terms of nuances and what other colleagues have said as to, one, the need for you to ensure that you have credibility by ensuring you focus on the money. The other part that has to do with you thinking through the risk analysis or risk assessment and putting systems and policies in place that can help you to safeguard your systems and your processes. The other part is at the point of starting nonprofits in this part of the world, and from what we've seen across Africa also, is the passion that people have, wanting to end a problem, and in the course of ending that problem, they want to hit the ground running. In the case of hitting the ground running, they give their registration services to lawyers who do not come back to tell them what their obligations and their responsibilities are. We do also have a regulatory environment that is not also raising awareness. So when I say regulatory environment, the regulators themselves, they're not raising awareness about the laws, and enforcement also has been largely weak. So these then meant that many nonprofits are not aware of those laws, and when they become aware, the processes for even complying becomes very, very tricky and sometimes tough. Because, you know, nonprofits have also not developed their structures in ways that can respond to those compliance issues. And it's all majorly around people relations, the money matters, the communications, the governance, the oversight. But again, because of the nature and the enormity of the challenges that we have across the continent, you'll find people quickly rushing to say, let's do this. In some instances, many would just want to do it at the individual level. However, because their interventions keeps growing and the need and demand for their services keeps growing, they are often advised by people to say, why not start a nonprofit, bring in more people to help you, and then let's see how you can do more. In the course of that, many have failed to pay attention to the dynamics of who actually owns a nonprofit by the time you start registering. What is the benefit of registration? Do you really have to register when you look at the obligations? All of this comes to when you now say, yes, I want to register with government for the purposes of being able to enjoy some certain benefits around tax waivers, around ability to open a bank account, and also that ability for you to be able to have your tax exemption status, including the opportunity to be able to bring charitable goods. So when you look at all of these elements, they fall within that trend of what we're saying, from organizations not knowing what the rules of the game are to when they know, there's that resistance of why should this be? I am using my money to be able to help others. Some would give you that analysis. Some would also tell you, yeah, I want to do good, but this is too restrictive and I think I'd better stop. So you find a lot of people also wanting to hide or wanting to stop the good work that they do. Over to you, Shalom.
Oyebisi, thank you. Thank you for that. A very practical and detailed response. And it's I think it's your perspective is quite interesting, because you've sort of highlighted certain challenges and realities in this experience. And I want to thank Sabrina Siegel for sending the question on implementing a culture change within organizations. Please, if you have questions, send them in the chat. We'll have a Q&A bit with the panelists, and Kris, maybe you can start thinking about that response, particularly for Sabrina as well. And Oyebisi, I know you have to leave, but if you do come back, just let us know. We'd be grateful for that. So Aisha, just building on what Oyebisi has spoken to, especially some of the challenges, the context that NGOs find themselves in. Context is everything, and even in compliance, this adage rings true. So what are some of the contextual realities on the continent for those who fund or partner with NGOs in Africa? And what are some of the considerations they need to keep in mind in order to improve compliance expectations in the long
run? Thank you, Shalom. I think it's really important that donors and other stakeholders understand the challenges that NGOs face working on the ground, and why, it's often not the case that people don't want to comply. It's that it's actually sometimes impossible to do so. So the first thing is that a lot of civil society are targeted by governments in Africa, actually. I mean, this is the case. There are some civil society organizations in Kenya that are target for executive action, and we see that taking place where you'll have some sort of random tax audit of an NGO, but it's politically motivated, and these are the NGOs that are seen to be saying things that are uncomfortable for the powers that be. Maybe it's something to do with human rights, maybe it's them representing marginalized communities. So the reality is that regulatory enforcement that masquerades as compliance needs to be unpacked, so that we are not victimizing people who are doing good work simply because they are unpopular with certain powers that be. So that's the first thing, to understand political context. The next is that Often in the spaces that these NGOs work, there's very little in the way of basic services, and that normal expectations that a donor will have that certain things will be provided by the government, they just don't exist. So you'll have communities that don't have running water, they don't have electricity, they don't have even access to basic security. And so, you need to understand that whereas in some other countries, these would be expectations that you could reasonably place on a government, often in Africa you can't, and NGOs actually play a role that really should be fulfilled by a government actor or a state actor. In terms of distributing and managing funds, there's often low penetration of bank accounts. So this is something that in Kenya, the government has been concerned about, trying to encourage more people to enter the formal banking sector. But a lot of the economy is informal, and a lot of Kenyans will not have access to bank accounts. And, donors may not understand this and may expect you to be able to pay into a bank account. And if you were to do that, you would miss out on a lot of the people you want to help. In a lot of countries that we're based in, there are high levels of day-to-day corruption. So this is what we call low-level corruption, where simply to get from place A to B, you will go through a traffic stop, you will be expected to pay a bit of money to move your goods and to essentially do what is something that you are legitimately entitled to do. There would be some sort of extra fee that you have to pay. And if you don't pay it, you won't get your work done, you won't do your business, and you won't reach the people you want to help. There might be an unreasonable expectation that you're able to document the recipients of your aid. And a lot of the people you want to target will be undocumented. So in Kenya, most adults are expected to be walking around with a national identification card. But actually, there are whole communities that for political reasons aren't given access to national ID cards. And there's a large refugee population that will be undocumented or may not have sufficient paperwork. So these are some of the things that donors need to understand so that when they set expectations on NGOs who work with them, the expectations are reasonable and they can be complied with, and they can still meet their core objective of helping people. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Aisha, and sharing these experiences and your reaction about grassroots NGOs and some of these standards that are set is quite interesting. And Kris, I want to sort of segue to you now, flipping everything. You could react to the points that Aisha has made, but also if you could shed some light on weighing up the costs of compliance versus the costs of non-compliance and what that would mean for an NGO.
Okay, and please let me know if you can't hear me clearly. I've tried to crank up the volume as much as I can, but I think being in Geneva is probably stretching the bandwidth. So for me, is the cost of compliance always worth it? The answer can sometimes be no, for a variety of reasons. For me, it comes down to risk versus reward, and what controls are you putting in place to mitigate those risks, and why are you trying to mitigate them? Compliance should always lean into supporting your mission and what you're trying to achieve. Often we see controls being layered upon layers of a new control. Something goes wrong, we add a new control. Something goes wrong, we add a new control. We add more compliance, more compliance, more compliance. And we forget about the cost of that compliance. And it's quite often, and it's something I've seen in many organizations I've worked with, where you have so many controls, you lose your ability to be agile and to respond to the communities you're meant to be serving. And things like procurement, which should be done quickly in the case of an emergency, suddenly takes 6 weeks because it needs 14 signatures. I think it's critical that we review our compliance frameworks against the risks they're trying to mitigate. Now, there's There's always going to be some hard red lines, like legal compliance, be it employment law, accounting regulations that we have to meet. But then a lot of compliance frameworks are around how do we ensure our operations are successful. And it's important to look at how do we make those compliance frameworks as effective and efficient as possible. One of the key options is digitization of controls, which removes people from the process and makes it a lot easier and less burdensome. So I always support NGOs in looking at how you reflect on how to further adapt your control framework. Then the other side of the argument is it worth just simply not complying with donor regulations or donor requirements, even if they are laborious, and hope they don't find out? So I saw a question in the chat, especially about the grassroots NGOs struggling to meet international donor compliance officer requirements. As a former international donor compliance officer of sorts, I completely agree. The problem is NGOs often sign up for those regulations saying they can meet those standards. I would always encourage NGOs to say, we don't have capacity to meet these demands. Can you fund us as part of the agreement to build capacity? And that is often something many international donors will support because they've got an agenda to grow their NGO base. But I think, as Willie said, if you have a lot of non-compliance and it comes to light, your reputation can be significantly impacted, which can have a devastating effect on an NGO. If I look at some of the cases that have been reported publicly, we had Goal, which failed to comply with a large set of its procurement regulations due to essentially an inside fraudster corrupting the system. Huge amount of funding suddenly paused, reputation very badly damaged with one of their key donors, and huge staff restructuring issues. You had Oxfam, who were at the height of the SEAH abuse scandal, and I think if you've seen the press recently, they've come back under fire for having similar issues in DRC. And again, their reputation is damaged, not just with their main donors, as in their governmental donors, but also with those who support them at a local level, so they're personal donors. And they've lost a huge amount of funding. And outside the NGO sphere slightly, but there was Adam Smith International, who basically failed to have a culture of compliance and doing the right thing at the very top of the organization, which led to a complete break of trust with DFID, who was at that point, I think, supplied 80% of their funding. The effect of that was funding being frozen, the organization having to downscale, make about 250 redundancies, and significantly shift their portfolio globally. So the cost of non-compliance can be huge. And a reputation takes years to build, but seconds to lose. So I think there's two sides there to sum up. You need to understand the risks that you're trying to mitigate and build an effective compliance framework that always adds value. And it goes to the question I saw in the chat about building a culture of compliance. It needs to be ingrained in your culture. Your team needs to be on board to support the values, and I'm sure we can answer those questions later. But at the same time, your senior leadership needs to recognize that if you don't comply, you sign up to agreements that you're not complying with, you're setting yourself up for significant scrutiny and potentially reputational damaging issues that could almost sink an NGO, especially a small one. I'm happy to take any questions later about that. Cheers.
Thank you so much for that, Kris. And you've spoken about reputation. And one aspect that I also know, especially with larger NGOs, but really any NGO, is also the impact that it has on the beneficiaries that you work with, because they're the ones who give you social license to say, come into our society, you know, and work with us. And so if there are non-compliance issues that damage your reputation, that subset of stakeholders is quite key. So I want to ask the last round of questions, also because I love the engagement I'm seeing on the chat. So Oyebisi, I want to come back to you and touch on a point that I made back earlier on when I was asking Willie about, NGOs are trying to do a lot of good. And, a lot of the members of Triple NGO that you work with are doing that. But if you could speak to NGOs now on the African continent, based on your experience, how do they balance what they're trying to do against, their main core mission, against the need to be compliant from a practical point of view? And you can highlight your response and touch on any of the issues that came up. I know you wanted to talk on the culture of compliance as well. So Oyebisi, I'll let you sort of give us that as your parting response, and then I'll come around to the other panelists as we conclude before the Q&A. And then quickly, before I forget, we'll share a feedback poll. Angelica, I think the team will pop that in for you to give us your feedback. So Oyebisi.
Okay, so for me, I think we should see compliance as a foundation for transparency, accountability, and sometimes legitimacy. And I'll say this, because compliance itself is to different stakeholders, just like accountability is to different stakeholders. You're looking at compliance to donor contracts or donor relationships. And this could be your grants onto individual donations that you're receiving. So for instance, let's say a friend decides to give you $5,000 to help 100 children. There is the need for you to report back. And that reporting back is part of that compliance mechanism that we have in place. There's a need for you to also think through how are you complying with regulations around your staffing? How are you communicating with your board? How are you ensuring that at the end of the year, you know how much you have spent and how much has come to you? And if you see regulation from the perspective of you being able to show your accountability and also to be transparent in the work you do, then compliance again becomes something that you are able to factor into your work. However, compliance also requires structures and it requires some level of funding. For instance, if you're going to be able to keep your annual reports or do your proper bookkeeping, it means that you must have someone with that expertise to be able to keep the proper records such that you can use that for your audits. Even if you're a small or a bigger nonprofit, you are expected, whether you register with government or not, to be able to say this was how much we made, this was how much our executive director or our founder has given to us, this is how much the board has given to us, and this is how we have spent it. This is normal in the course of everyday business for all of us. Imagine you as a family head or someone that has given money to your children to say, do X, Y, Z. You would expect accountability and say, I've done this with this money. This is your change, all right? So if we look at that within the context of what we do as nonprofits, don't forget that we enjoy public trust. That's why we're able to do what we're doing at this time. And one of my colleagues on this, as one of the panelists mentioned to the issue of the trust that we enjoy. When you look at the trust deficit we have globally now, nonprofits are still being trusted. However, we do not want our compliance to be, to be rigid. I like a system where you have complied, you're seeing challenges, and you're sitting with regulators to say these are the challenges we're seeing, and this is how to mitigate them in terms of participation. So the culture of compliance itself must start from the leadership, all right? Kris alluded to the fact that if you're complying or not complying, it has implications for whether a donor or any other organization wants to work with you. And I'm sure you would have heard a lot of times when you're speaking to other different stakeholders, they'll keep mentioning credible civil society or credible NGOs. What does credible mean? Credible means that they can see your books, they can see your work, you're not obscured, they can ask you questions, you can answer those questions. Basically, the kind of things we ask of government to say, be transparent, be accountable to us in terms of the resources. It's always very easy to say the money that we're using is given to us by our founder. Yes, you have to try, be accountable to your founder. You have to be accountable to other different stakeholders and also your beneficiaries. Within all of that are many of the things that compliance is asking you for. For instance, when you register with with government. You are expected to be an organization that is tax exempt. That means whatever activity you're doing because you're a non-profit. And government would like to know that you're still fulfilling that purpose and that you're not saying you're a non-profit and you're trading or using the cover of non-profits to make money. All right. So they've asked that, okay, let's see your taxes, let's see your books to be sure that you've not done business. Okay. So again, you have to look at that and say to yourself, and of course, your freedom of association guarantees that you don't necessarily have to register, provided you're not interested in enjoying government incentives. So the culture of transparency itself, or the culture of compliance, starts with an organization that has a DNA for accountability and for transparency, all right? And then moving that into what systems, what policies, what laws helps us to safeguard our own system in such a way that we can be transparent, we can be accountable, and we can build our way to sustainability. Most times we are expected that as non-profits, we should have these ethics that guide our work. There are some basic minimum that are expected from us. And if you have followed Twitter conversations over the last 3, 4, 5 months, you would see a trend where non-profits are being called out to say, how much have you guys received from donors? How are you spending this? Why are we not seeing impact? And let's assume that you are hacked by one of your beneficiaries, all right, to say, I had heard that you've collected XYZ. Can you tell me how you have used it? Are we able to answer those questions critically? That is how to build the culture. And that culture also helps us to be able to comply. And I must tell you, compliance can be expensive, especially for a non-profit that wants to do good and that is very small, that has very little overhead to even pay salaries for a good finance officer. And this is where tools comes in. For us as the Nigerian Network of NGOs, what we have done as a national association is to start training our members on how to comply, however, giving them basic tools that can help them to comply seamlessly, including also taking their challenges to regulators. So when they tell us that they can't do XYZ, for instance, they can't open a bank account because of XYZ, we ask them to complete like a small survey, and we analyze those surveys and take it to regulators to advocate for the need for those laws to change, or for the procedures for registration or for complying with those laws to change. And regulators are listening to us because we've gone based on, you've said we should comply. We've motivated our members to comply. We've raised awareness for them to comply. However, at the point of compliance, these are the challenges that they're seeing. In the last 6, 7, 8 months alone, as the Nigerian Network of NGOs, we have trained about 800 NGOs within our membership, traveling across different parts of the country to tell them what the laws are on compliance, to listen to them on what they think should change. And we're using that to engage with government. For instance, we have a document that we call What We Heard on, there's one of the laws in Nigeria that is the Companies and Allied Matters Act. So we listen to everybody. We put everything that was said for and against the law into a report that we called What We Heard on the Part F of Khanna. And we submitted it to government in order for government to use it to retool. As at last week, I was also sitting with the regulators to say, these are the concerns from the sector. These are the realities in terms of law A, law B, law C. And these are the things that needs to change. I think from that perspective as a whole, because if one individual complies and the other is not complying, it affects the sector as a whole. And we must understand that, bigger nonprofits and medium-sized nonprofits have a role to play in ensuring that they comply and they use their resources to motivate others to comply, plus also using the lessons they've learned in compliance to retool regulations.
Brilliant. No, thanks for that, Oyebisi. And I love something that you said a while back about it being in the DNA of the organization and getting to that point. And if it's there, then from a principled and valued point, you touched on transparency, accountability. It's then easier to build to build that culture. So I want us to wind up and sort of start engaging on some of the issues that are being raised in the chat. Willie, my last question for you is, so now thinking practically forward-looking for those on the call, NGOs with limited resources, be it time, be it staff, be it technical expertise, what simple steps, practical, can they take first? Like right now after this call, or tomorrow, or next week, what can an NGO do to be more compliant?
Thank you. I mean, I think it's as simple as start with the industry. So learn from other NGOs, learn from international NGOs. Don't reinvent the wheel. I mean, there are so many sectors that we're working with, and they're learning so much from one another. There are certain templates, there's technology, there are certain things that you can get from them, and it won't cost you anything. So that's the first thing. Secondly, and I think it links to what Kris mentioned, follow a risk-based approach. Understand your risk or your risks. Make sure that you respond proportionately to that. Don't go and design a massive and a heavy framework if you don't need it. Understand your risk and make sure you respond to the risks that you are facing. Get buy-in from leadership. I mean, if you're the compliance officer or head of audit or in the finance division and you're tasked with this, get the buy-in from the leadership. Demonstrate to them that there's value in terms of implementing this. Demonstrate to them through a business plan. Demonstrate to them that it's the right thing to do, and then have the right attitude. I've seen so many entities, NGOs, NGOs with very heavy frameworks, but they've got a tick box exercise. So it's not about complying; it's about showing people that we're trying to comply. And there's a totally different mindset. So you can be very small, but very personal, and make sure that your controls are linked to the risk. So even small organizations can get that right. Take small steps. Don't try and implement everything at once. It's a marathon. It's not a sprint. Make sure that you start small and raise the awareness with the people in the business. So make sure that there's one person in finance, one person in operations, one in HR that's working with you on this thing. Then that will assist you in terms of raise the awareness and also to make sure that you actually get things done. Then the last point I'm going to make is, or two more points. The last one, the second last one is review, evaluate, and discuss. Those three words are key. So when you start implementing this, review it consistently to make sure it's proportionate, it addresses your risks, evaluate your framework or the controls that you implement, and then discuss it with management, because that's the only way that you're going to keep the buy-in from them. That's the only way that potentially you can get some funding for this. I mentioned this before, but I'm going to say it again. It's not a one size fits all. You have to make sure that it's fit for purpose for your organization. And the last thing I want to mention is approach it holistically. Kris mentioned a very important thing where he said that some organizations are responding to certain risks. So today it's environmental. Now there's a team doing environmental. Tomorrow it's fraud. So there's a forensic team doing that. And then there's a team doing safeguarding. Make sure you've got one framework that's agile enough and you can hook on more risks that you can manage holistically.
Thanks for that, Willie. I like how you broke it down. If I was a participant, I would have been taking notes. And I like your, the review edit discussed, the red in terms of just thinking about it. So sort of the same question, practical advice from your perspective. So Kris, I'll come to you and then we'll close with Aisha. So Kris, the same?
Yeah, certainly. I'll try and avoid repeating everything that Willie said, which I completely agree with. I think the first thing is, I've seen some comments in the chat about compliance being a donor's stick or small NGOs not having, it not being part of their operation. I think that's a key mindset point, that you need to build your compliance framework that fits you and your organization. Not, as Willie made the point, not just reacting to donor needs. So the next area, I think you need to build a culture of compliance, call it risk management, call it values, call it something that gets you, your senior leadership and your team on board, and it becomes just a standard part of your operations. I think when you try and bolt on compliance as an added extra, it becomes straight away seen as a burden. And that isn't just in small NGOs or mid-sized NGOs, that's in every organization I've worked in 20 years. You know, it's got to be seen as a core value that helps deliver for the communities they're working for. On a practical point of view, I think first of all, start by mapping what your compliance requirements are. So as of today, what do you have to comply with? And then on top of that, layer on, what does your current control framework look like? Because that will allow you, first of all, to identify any areas of over control, where your controls are costing you too much and it's taking too much time and removing your agility, but also identify any gaps in your current control framework that need to be addressed. It's going to help you balance. Many organizations have lost sight of what their control framework is because it's built up holistically year on year, reacting to various different demands. I think the other side of it is to, again, this goes back to the point of buy-in, is to really get your teams to understand that compliance isn't just something for finance, for HR, for your sort of corporate functions. Compliance is something that works into, or I use the term risk management, into everything you do. It's part of your operation, so it becomes normalized. I think also try, for those of you who are looking for donor funding or looking to work with donors, have a look around at some of the changes in the sector. So often there is indicators of where donors will be looking to put more focus on when it comes to compliance. I would suggest right now, with an economic downturn post-COVID, for many donors, that financial compliance, so looking at external audits, looking at your finances, and looking and justifying how funds are being used. If I was a betting man, I would say that is an area donors will be scrutinizing more in the next 18 to 24 months. And given they've always focused on that, I think be prepared for an uptick. One of the questions in the chat was about how do you build a culture of compliance? And I'll end with this. It takes time. So going back to Willie's point, small steps. The key there is tone at the top. It has to come from senior leadership. So you have to be bought in. If you try and implement compliance or risk management and senior leaders are seen to be saying one thing and doing something else, so not complying with their own rules and regulations, it will not filter through the organization. I would always encourage you to have a compliance or risk management champion at the very top of the organization who is seen as credible. Then it's a case of education, 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 getting out to your teams, explaining to the new processes, the new policies, how they're going to work, and more importantly, how they're going to enhance the humanitarian work they're doing. You know, most people join an NGO to make the world a better place, not to tick boxes. So we need to help them understand how compliance adds value to the valuable humanitarian work they're doing. And then finally, to support that, there has to be a level of oversight. You can write all of the new policies, all of the new procedures, and you can set up new systems as much as you want. But if people don't follow them, then they're just going to be pieces of paper that sit in someone's desk. So having a oversight function, be it a second line function in management with some basic spot checks on looking at what they're doing, how a new policy is being rolled out, perhaps for the first 12 months of its life, how people on the field are not only complying with it, but how are they finding it in its use? Is it supporting their delivery? Is it becoming a burden? That kind of oversight is really important. It's not just a stick to say, you've been naughty, you've not followed the rules, but also it's getting feedback on if the rules are effective. So it allows you to make changes to your framework. And I would always, as an internal auditor, encourage some form of internal or external audit review of any changes to your control framework to, again, give you feedback to see how it's working. and to allow you to make adaptations and changes on things that aren't working. Either they're not being complied with, or they're ineffective and they're actually impacting your delivery. So those would be the main pieces of advice I would give.
Thank you for that, Kris. Again, very, very detailed and relevant and practical. I mean, I love the idea of a compliance champion. I think, you know, it could be anyone in the organization, just taking that responsibility and keeping everyone on toes in that sense. I love the questions that are coming in. Aisha, I want to come to you to sort of also share your practical parting shots on this. And then we'll come around to the questions. And feel free, Aisha, if you do want to respond to any one or two questions that have come up in the chat as well, as you give your final response. So Aisha?
Yeah, hi. I think a lot has been said around, you know, the tips to improve compliance. So a lot, you know, I don't want to repeat it, but I thought the first thing that was important is to be very frank with your donors and your other stakeholders about the challenges you face in your environment. So just to be upfront at the beginning to say, you know, the people we distribute to don't have bank accounts, or they don't have identification documents. What can we come up with together that might work in that environment? Also, I think record keeping is a key part of compliance. So often people think compliance is a lot of policies and procedures, but at a basic level, I think it's just showing value for money. Can you know, is there a way you can document and record what you did or what you tried to do in terms of meeting some obligations? So, you know, I was thinking of things like taking photos and videos when you're distributing something, and maybe taking some contact telephone numbers of people and providing that to donors to say that, you know, they can feel free to contact some of these people themselves and confirm that what you're saying actually did take place. You yourself would need to be very close to the ground. So, you know, you might have somebody in the office who, you know, once a month calls around, you know, to suppliers, to beneficiaries, and just has a chat with them about what is the experience dealing with your organization. Is it helpful? Is it very bureaucratic? Maybe there's something going on that you're not aware of. Maybe there's some relationships that you're not aware of. And so this might be an easy, cheap way of picking this up. So you have maybe a different person every month and they call different people. And that might just give you access to more information. Willie's team does provide a lot of support, but it comes at a cost. But something that might be easy is to have some sort of complaints procedure where if somebody is unhappy about something, maybe there's an email address they can send a complaint to, you know, and it could be a complaint about anything, but often organizations come to hear about a problem, you know, a long time after the event. And often the complaint comes through some sort of whistleblower. So having an ability where people are able to give you feedback, either to yourself or to third parties, if you are flexible, that the feedback can be anonymous, maybe this is a way you can monitor and actually check that what you have in place works. So yes, those are some of my tips. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Aisha. And I think you've done well and very practical. I like that, especially after everyone had given their tips as well. So I want us to come to the questions, and thank you for sharing them. Keep sharing them. I've gone up to some of the earlier questions, and I'll direct them to some panelists. Some could be for anyone to answer. There are two questions that have been touched on, and Kris, I don't know if you can tackle this around. So Abdallah spoke about the lack of a concerted approach to donor compliance, where different donors have different requirements, and someone else mentioned it as well in the chat. How does an NGO deal with the duality or the multiplicity of compliance requirements from donors? And then there's a question here that is quite practical around, so Kris, you'll start, and Willie, I don't know if you want to take this one. we had someone from South Sudan, or Sudan rather, highlighting that, we're talking about financial controls and money, but some organizations don't have access to banks. So what would that mean from a financial controls point of view? And Aisha, you could also share feedback on that. And then we also had a question from Sabrina. Sabrina asked, so yes, risk and compliance is important. These people need to be at the table, but how do you convince management to come to the table? I think Kris, I've asked you a specific question. Willie and Aisha may be the one on banking and financial controls and a lack of institutional banking. And then the one on management, anyone can really pick up on. So let's start with those. Kris, we'll start with you, then we'll go to Willie, then we'll end with Aisha, then we'll come back to more questions.
So, dealing with multiple donor demands for compliance. I don't have an easy answer. It's something in my current role that I'm dealing with every day. I think one of the key challenges is to understand what the donors are asking for. What I found while working in IFRC is that often donors will ask for, at least international donors, will ask for similar compliance requirements, but in very different ways. So they may be asking for risks data, for example, but in one agreement it will say, we want to have insights to your control framework. In another, it will say, we want you to share your risk registers with us. There might be conflicting audit demands. So one donor may require an audit every 6 months, while another donor wants an audit of our finances on appeal every 12 months. So what we've taken to is negotiating with donors and sort of explaining what compliance arrangements we already have in place with other donors, and trying to set out to them why one piece of assurance that we already have or already getting is enough to meet their needs, and also means that it reduces the cost burden of the controls they're asking for, which in turn means that there'll be more money going to the affected communities, more money for their operational demands. Does that discussion always go in our favor? No. Sometimes we end up with heavy compliance burdens. There is an interesting debate going on globally around in the grand bargain, discussing how is risk sharing being done. And one of the biggest challenges that comes up in every session is donors need to take more accountability for the requirements they're putting on NGOs. What we're seeing quite a lot in those debates is donors effectively trying to transfer the majority of their risk onto NGOs who don't have all the capacity or capability to mitigate the risks of the donors down to the lowest level. So there's this gap. And at the same time, that disparity is being pushed further because NGOs are often under financial constraints, accepting these kind of funding arrangements and agreeing to compliance frameworks they simply cannot meet. A good example would be I worked with an NGO who had an annual turnover of about £500,000, but they then accepted funding from DFID for a £15 million program and hadn't anticipated the additional work that would put on their finance team to meet the compliance requirements. And it was a finance team, I use the phrase loosely, of one person who suddenly couldn't complete their invoice oversight, the basic finance checks, and unsurprisingly, at the end of the program, there was a huge gap in data, and the NGO was faced with potential bankruptcy because of ineligible funding and the ineligible use of funding. Luckily, we managed to address it, but there's also an accountability point there for the donor that they shouldn't have given an organisation who didn't have the capacity that kind of funding without giving them additional support. So the other side of it is you need to be upfront with your donors and be willing to push back, which I know is really difficult. I'm having the exact same debates around funding with some significant donors who want huge amounts of compliance. And we think we can give it them in different ways. But half of the battle I've found is getting them to speak the same language and to understand what they're really after and what risks they're really trying to mitigate. And that can mean an extended process of negotiation around the agreement. So I know that's not the answer. If anyone does have the answer, how to get donors to all work exactly the same way, please tell me. It's something we've all been trying to solve. Cheers. Back to you, Shalom.
Thanks for that, Kris. No, I think it's definitely quite complicated, and I think you've done a good job of trying to respond to that. Willie, I'll come to you, and Willie, I'll take advantage of you responding next to sort of peg on two questions that I saw from Margaret and Randy around resources. What resources are there that are available for NGOs to meet compliance? Ideally, what's free, what's available in addition to what you're going to say. Willie, you're on mute.
I'll answer that, and then I see there's a question about 3 lines of defense, which links to that. I really think it depends on, and I don't want to go back to what I've said, but it depends on the risks that you are facing, the complexity of your organization, how big you are. I mean, Kris just mentioned an organization with 50,000 or 500,000 pounds or dollars budget basically for the year, or funding, and then they got 500 or whatever the case might be. So it really depends on how big the organization. If you are a small organization, you've got someone doing audit, there's no reason why that person can't do some of the compliance function. If you're 10 or 15 people office, that's what you have to do. If you're a large organization, then you can have 3 lines of defense, and maybe just to explain that to the people on the call, your first line of defense is normally your business, the people that are on the front line, and then your compliance people are the second line of defense. So what they will do is they will give the policies, the procedures, the guidelines, and they will assist the first line, the business people, to implement these policies and procedures. So they will give them guidelines on how to do it. They'll do the training with the risk champions and the likes. And then your audit or potentially external audit function will come in to give assurance that whatever the compliance people or the second line, whatever they advised, actually the first line implemented effectively. So those are the 3 lines of defense, and it's awesome if you can have it. But we don't always have the luxury of having enough resources, enough staff to be able to do that. And then your second line, which is your compliance people, they might be more involved in the implementation of certain processes to make sure it happens. To move on to resources, obviously that the finance function, we mentioned that is key. From a compliance point of view, I really see a lot of value in a compliance professional, someone that understands compliance, someone that understands risk, and very specific to your sector. And that brings me to the second answer, which is in Sudan, where people are saying, listen, we are dealing with cash. So what do we do now? I go back to what I said earlier. I think it is just a different risk. So you identify that as a high risk area. So if there's an internal audit, those are the type of things they must now go and audit, because maybe your procurement is in Nairobi, it's centralized, and that's not the high risk area. So why do you want to audit that? So I don't see anything wrong with cash. It just increases your risk. But therefore, I think you have now to adjust your approach and make sure that the underlying documents relating to those cash transactions are quality, they are checked, and people must know still, even if you deal with cash, there are ways that you can manage and check actually what was paid and the likes. Shalom.
Thanks for that, Willie, and you know, thanks for highlighting. Especially, I like your response that, you know, yes, you can operate with money, cash, but the risks are different. And Kris has just shared a response on donor risk sharing. And Aisha, I'll come to you for your response as well and reactions.
Shalom, am I talking about, what am I talking about? Is it this lack of access to bank accounts, or is it something else?
I think Willie has touched on that. I've seen some questions actually, and I want to segue into something else. I think, I don't have the names now, but I think Kris mentioned it, and even Nasi touched on political risks, right? And what, you know, what this means, because some feel like compliance and the overbearingness of certain governments, I think the Kenyan example has been given, is just for governments to clamp down on NGOs for dubious political reasons, right? So maybe you're working in a certain space, or you're saying government is not providing this service. How do you deal with that? And I think Nuse or Yunus also mentioned that. So maybe you can shed some light on that, because I know you touched on that as well.
Yes, I mean, I think political risk exists not obviously just in Africa, even in the US and other jurisdictions, in particular types of sectors. So I think, you know, if you've decided as an NGO to focus on a particular area, as part of your own risk assessment, you need to understand what risks you face. If it's in, you know, if you're operating in human rights, and what you're exposing your staff to, because you have obligations to protect people, and what you can do to mitigate those risks. You can never eliminate risk to zero, but you can mitigate. And some of the ways are by, you know, perhaps documenting, having conversations with, you know, police or regulators about the risks as you perceive them, and seeking their help. And really, that doesn't mean you expect them to help. It's more that you're documenting an issue so that if something happens later, you're able to refer to it. So documentation is quite important. Making sure you're using maybe social media to highlight any risks or threats that you feel are coming your way. In Kenya, we have a very active civil society, and we also see people bringing a lot of cases in court. So, you know, sometimes you can lobby or bring strategic litigation if you feel that you're being victimized. And the courts are often very sympathetic to this issue of the executive overstepping its powers. And often it does do so in certain areas. So I think that you first have to understand the risks you face. You have to accept them. You have to see how you can mitigate them. And then you have to be able to explain them to others. So you need to be able to explain to a donor that this is a particular risk you feel that you're facing. And it's usually good to explain this before there's a crisis. So if you're operating in a very challenging environment where other organizations are being, you know, closed down around you, you need to be documenting this is happening around you, so that the next time you find yourself under an investigation, you've already created this narrative that there may be more to this investigation than just compliance. So I think building on a narrative, documenting it, being seen as people who are very open and transparent and going to the public about issues. We see that often in Kenya, when something is highlighted in the media, actually people who are reluctant to help are forced to then intervene. So public pressure is useful, but you may not have that. And that's why you may have to go around with your phone and record certain things on video, so that you are able to evidence that such and such a thing happened. So there isn't one approach. I think you have to be quite creative sometimes about how you manage risk, but it is manageable. I mean, we operate in this climate and we are able to do so effectively, but also we have to be sensible about what we take on and how we take it on.
Thank you for that, Aisha. I hope that's relevant to all the participants across the continent. There are two questions I want us to close with. One, I want Willie to answer. and then I want Kris to give us the last report. So Billy, Adam asks, let's say a staff member involved in compliance is being investigated, but at the same time is being asked to confirm or authorize the authenticity of supporting documents, because I guess they're the ones who have that experience. How could this work? And Adam, I hope I get that right, and really maybe I hope that's clear to you. But I think is that duality of maybe it's a very direct experience where maybe this staff member was involved, but they might be an accountant and they're the ones who can authenticate documents. How does one deal with that? Then Kris, I'll come to you. Really go.
So thanks, Shalom. I don't know whether I get it 100%, but I think it will have something to do with your policies and your procedures on how you react to potential investigations or allegations. Now, if you've got a staff member involved, there are a number of things I think that are important. And it is, if you're an international NGO, you potentially have a team that's doing the investigations from somewhere else, or you might have an external party like myself to do the investigation. In an instance like that, I don't see a problem because the investigators will obviously request for people to validate or give them their version, but they will also validate themselves to some extent. So I don't think that's necessarily a problem. If someone within the organization do the investigation, then I think it's potentially it adds complexity to it. I don't know whether that answers the question. If not, please you can respond and I can give it a go.
No, thanks for that. Thanks for that, Billy. And I think your response, at least to me, has been helpful. Adam, I hope it is. The final question before I hand over to Angelica, Kris, is from Josephine in Nigeria. And Josephine says that what they find in Nigeria is that donors give them funds for service delivery, and it's limited in terms of overheads or institutional core funding. So the broader, the broader need or the larger need is for them to have, funding, which the resources just don't provide for, core elements of their work. So how do they, I assume, ensure compliance broadly when the resources are channeled towards more programmatic work, yet, finances, taxes, all institutional elements, leases, are not addressed, and they might not have the resources to fully focus on that. Does that make sense? I hope I have that right, Justin, and you can clarify.
It makes sense. It goes back to my point that you need to build your compliance framework for you and not for your donors. Donors have a level of expectation, and I'll say this from my experience with them, that you already have basic compliance frameworks in place. Robust donors should carry out a level of due diligence where they'll look at your compliance framework, they'll look at your policies, your processes, and see if you can meet those requirements around leases, finance, etc. However, from my experience, especially in the field, that doesn't always happen, especially with a field office to a local NGO. You can always ask the donor and say you don't have the requirements to meet their framework, but I know the drive will be for the programmatic funding to get it in, and you're probably under an agreement that they will say you get 4 to 5% to cover your core costs, your central costs. So I think it's important to look at what you can actually deliver with that funding and be clear to your donor if there are expectations that you're, managing, you're having a full investigation function, so the full, or there's expectations that you have a robust SEA policy with SEA investigators on call. You need to be frank that you can't meet that compliance need. Often NGOs fall foul because we accept funding that we can't meet. And I've had, that's not just local NGOs, that's international organisations as well. I've had that debate in my own organisation. I think it goes back to the point that map your current local compliance requirements. What do you have to meet your objectives? And then put a plan in place for setting up a framework that ensures that those points of compliance are met. And then anything from a donor that goes on top of that requires additional, I think that's when you have to have the discussion with the donor and say we need funding. Or allocate a position of every program you're looking at, because I tend to find the 5%, 3% of funding allocation actually doesn't always go towards core costs. It is often divvied up for other projects or other internal enhancements. And I completely agree that donors have a responsibility to enhance NGOs, but that if my experience with donors would say that they are more akin to pushing their risks onto you, and you need to be aware of that. If the budgets and the costs aren't appropriate for delivery, then you have to push back. Donors are not going to change while NGOs are accepting very, very difficult terms and conditions, and that's a horrible reality. But they're facing political pressure at home to, especially governmental donors who it's easier for me to speak to. They're facing very much political pressure at home to maximize every penny spent, any piece of funding spent to an NGO, and they're facing increasingly hostile public perception when it comes to international funding for humanitarian aid, especially post-COVID. So that makes it very difficult for them to justify additional spend for an NGO to support you. Hopefully that will change. And we have ongoing debates with those big government donors, and I have contacts within the donor circle that I speak to, especially around the grand bargain, which is very much focused on this. But I don't have an easy solution to give you that says, how do you get donors to give you more money for your core compliance? My only suggestion is build it for yourself first, meet your own core needs for basic compliance, link it to your values, link it to your risks, so it adds value to your operations, rather than seeing it as an addition that we do just for donors. I think that will be able to identify those red lines of what is extra, and what is our normal day-to-day. Back to you, Shalom.
Kris, thank you for that that response. And ladies and gentlemen, I want to conclude now before I hand over back to Angelica and thank the panelists. There's a question by Anthony. I think it was at 28 minutes past the hour. Kris, maybe you can look at that. Nasri, thank you so much for responding to that. Oyebisi, thank you again for engaging on the chat. It's good to see you back. And Randy, you'd asked about pro bono organizations that help with compliance. I will self-promote Trust Law, the Thomson Reuters legal service that provides free legal support to NGOs such as yourselves. I've sent a link to our website. You can join the service, it's free, and get free legal advice. If there are other resources that you can get on free compliance support, we will definitely see how to share them. Willie, Aisha, Kris, Oyebisi, thank you so much for the insights you've shared, for your experience, for the expertise that you've provided. We're truly grateful to call you partners and to be able to tap into your expertise and knowledge, some of it which comes at a cost. So we thank you for taking the time to really share this. I would like to hand it over now back to Angelica to conclude. So Angelica, back to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shalom. So some of the key points to highlight from this conversation are NGOs are not immune from compliance risk. Compliance needs to be structured, needs to reflect the NGO's mission. Having standard documentation for donors is key. Having an insurance map. There are legal consequences that could lead to personal liability with even criminal consequences. Financial control is very important for the sustainability of NGOs. Regulatory enforcement needs to be unpacked and understand the political context. If you don't comply, your reputation can be significantly affected. The culture of transparency needs a company that has a DNA of accountability and transparency. Compliance can be expensive, and at a point of being compliant, there are many challenges that can come. It is key to learn from other NGOs and understand your risks. Demonstrate to the leadership the importance of compliance. Make sure you start small. Review, evaluate, restart. Make sure it is proportional. Don't just react to donor needs. Map your compliance requirements and look at your current framework. Compliance needs to become normalized as part of your operations. Donors need to take more accountability for their requirements to ask to NGOs. Thank you very much, Shalom. Thank you very much to the speakers. This was a very insightful conversation. Thank you to the audience. Please note that you can revisit this video in the ALN Academy's YouTube channel, which right now is live. You can revisit it. And thank you so much. So it's time we close our webinar. Thank you.
Hey, Angelica, you can end the webinar. I mean, not Angelica, Imelda. You're the host.